Hey, Talking Joe fans, it's Mark here, and we have got another sketchbook original art episode. As always, this is very visual intensive, so I would suggest that if you can, head on over to the Talking Joe YouTube channel where you can see the full visuals for this episode. But if not, then you're welcome to listen to just the audio version only and have our words generate images in your own imagination. Or you can also simply head on over to patreon.com/talkingjoe and find the relevant post, the Chuck Costas sketch art post, where I will have posted a PDF of the art that we are discussing that you can also look at. So you're in for a treat today. We are talking to Chuck Costas, who, without exaggeration, has one of the greatest collections of G.I. Joe original art ever assembled. So, relax, sit back, and listen to the episode as Tim and I talk to the man himself, Chuck Costas.
Live from the Talking Joe studios, it's Talking Joe.
You seem normal.
Hey! Welcome to Talking Joe live stream, looking at original art again. And today we are very excited because we have a special guest with an incredible collection. It is Chuck Costas. And joining me to talk about it will be Tim Finn. So I'm going to put him into the stream. Here's Tim.
Hello, Mark, and hello, streamers. Is that the word for people watching this? Hello, live streamers and
the internets.
People watching
all of the
this
internets.
After. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Now, Chuck might not realize this, but on this show, when we have a special guest, I have to make a jingle for them. And here's Chuck's.
This guy, Chuck. This guy, Chuck. We're in luck. He's no schmuck. It's this guy, Chuck.
Wow.
Here he is.
That
This guy,
amazes
Chuck.
me. I think we just end the show there. That's it. Disco Duck, one of my favorite Rick D songs. You're going way back there from back in the day.
Good memory, yeah.
Yes, and that picture that you found of me with the Wookiee, also very nice. But
what a Wookiee.
We're talking Joe today, though. We're talking Joe
exactly. Today. Yeah, so, and specifically your amazing collection, a few highlights, from what it selecting the highlights must have been a task, because I know that you've got an incredible selection. And just looking even behind you, it's a museum.
Yeah, all stuff we don't have time to talk about all this today, but I figured I would decorate for the occasion today and sort of make sure that my wife is out of town, so I could do whatever I want with the basement.
Go crazy.
Today, so.
If I zoom in on you, Chuck, maybe you can just give a few seconds guided tour of what is actually behind you there, because it is super cool.
Sure. I'll start. I guess it's reverse over here. I'll start over in this corner, which is I also, aside, I guess my day job is I work for a company called Prop Store. I was a consultant for many years, and after I sort of left that career, I decided, what do I really want to do? I moved out. I'd already moved out to LA and said I'd love to be in the movie prop business. And so, prior to that, though, I was a customer, and one of the auctions that Prop Store held was the G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra auction a few years ago. So I, despite what people think of the movie, I think people love it and hate it relative to it. But for me, it was just a great way of translating the G.I. Joe world into the real world. And I have a few different swords. These are from both Rise of Cobra as well as Retaliation. Storm Shadow, and then two different swords from Snake Eyes there. A couple of the Neo Viper helmets, as well as one of the bombs, one of the Mars bombs there that Storm Shadow launches, and you remember with the nanomites inside there. So very, very cool. And then over there in the corner is also Snake Eyes, the Arctic version of Snake Eyes, sort of reminiscent of G.I. Joe 2. And then over in the other corner, we've got the Scarlet costume, and then one of the Mars briefcases that held the nanobombs inside there. So for those that are movie fans, and also decked out today in one of the jackets from the movie as well. You know, if you, how better way to enjoy movie props and costumes than to wear them around. So, but if anybody else wants there, I think we do actually have some on propstore.com. So if you're a Joe fan and you want one of these, there's a little plug. Yeah, Tim?
Chuck, do you have your tickets for Snake Eyes, and what clothing will you wear to that movie?
You know, I don't think I'm going to be wearing a Snake Eyes costume. It's a little bit form-fitting, and I've eaten a few too many pies as of lately. But you know, I don't know. We'll have to see. I might just go as a normal guy. I don't know. I am looking forward. I heard great things about the new Snake Eyes film, so really looking forward to seeing what's going on with that. And then in the background, you'll see some artwork. You know, we'll talk more about my relationship with Mike Zeck over the years. But, you know, one of the things I had the pleasure of doing as being one of the original G.I. Joe art collectors is I met Mike Zeck back in 1986 and started buying G.I. Joe covers from him because that was really my favorite thing to do. Nobody else seemed to want them at the time. And so month to month, Mike would just offer me different covers. And, you know, as he was drawing them. And in fact, I would talk to him over the phone and he would tell me what was on the drawing board that day. And, you know, I remember G.I. Joe Special Missions 1 when that was coming out. He was sort of describing coming over the ship and, you know, what he was drawing there. So some special memories in that, but some covers that I acquired from Mike over the years. The G.I. Joe 39, the 52, I can't really see all these things because you have to go to the reverse angle here on things, but I will get out of the way. So you got the 39, the 52, and then you've got Special Missions 2 and Special Missions 4 when I switched over to the other side. And then a very special piece, which is the G.I. Joe Yearbook number 3. And we'll talk also, hopefully we can talk a little bit more about the exhibit of Mike Zeck art that I'm going to be helping to host later on this year at the Ringling College of Art and Design. That's going to be starting on October 18th through December 10th, 2021. So if you get a chance to be in Sarasota, Florida, you can see all those pieces live, as well as a whole host of other G.I. Joe art. And it's actually Hasbro is officially sort of giving us the license to show these things. So I think it's a great opportunity for Joe fans as well as fans of Mike Zeck to see some great artwork that Mike's done over the years.
Excellent. And yeah, if you ever want to see the cover of that features the first appearance of everyone's favorite character, Sarawak Sally, then that's the cover. We just discussed the latest issue, which I don't know if you've read it yet, Chuck, but features the return of a character only ever seen in Special Missions 4, and not.
I did not know that they were going into the Wayback Machine on that, but you know, those October Guard stories were always some of my favorite ones. And that was I always just loved the cover on that, the upside down. You know, being caught in a tree, and I just thought the angle on that particular one was pretty spectacular. But anyway, that's what's in the room today. It will not be there later today, but and when my wife gets home, it'll be back the way it was.
I have a kickoff question, which is, what is the first piece of comic art that you bought, and how did you sort of come to that decision that you? Had there been collectors in your family? Was this the natural outgrowth from comics, or where and what and how?
Yeah, I guess, you know, sort of painting the picture, and I'm sure folks that are watching this may have similar experiences. I grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is right outside Washington, D.C.
Me too.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that, Tim. Yeah, and I think the culture in D.C., we had a great comic book or I guess convention schedule that was going on. Every month you could go to, there was pretty much 2 to go to. There was a Jubilee convention and there was a Creation, because Creation was the third, and then there was Serendipity as well. So we really had 3 major conventions that were rotating through the DC area, whether you're on the Virginia side or the Maryland side, or sometimes occasionally in DC itself. But as part of that, they would always have guests there. And I think that was something that was maybe a little different than some of the other conventions around the country, is that we always had a plethora of guests. And so I'd always see people come through. We had John Romita Jr., we had Mike Zeck came through at some point, Ron Wilson. But at one point, I sort of struck up a conversation with Rich Rankin, who people may not know. He was the inker that was working with Bill Willingham on the Elementals. And really, got to know him and liked him, and decided that one day, and I think it was 1985, to buy a piece of artwork. And it was the first piece I bought was an Elementals 2 page 1, which was frankly from an art collector's perspective probably not the best page to buy. It was just a picture of the FBI Seattle building, no characters on it whatsoever, but I just thought it was so well drawn that, and it was just a great thing to put on the wall that I had to say, that was the first piece. So it was, I think Rich was charging $10. I think he gave me a discount and sold it to me for $5. And that, but comic books at the time were what, 75 cents, 60 cents, something like that. So, it's still a little bit more than buying just a single comic book. So that was my first investment, Tim. I mean, it was and I think it went from there. But for me, it was a bit early on. It was about creating a connection with the artists because you couldn't really find, eBay wasn't around, and you couldn't find a real large selection of older art at these conventions. It was really comic books at those, and then whatever the artist of the day sort of brought with them, and then you'd have a chance to buy things from them.
I remember being confused at my third or fourth convention in 1990 that there was a dealer selling original art. It's like the cover to Wolverine number 21 or 22, right? Where it's all yellow and Wolverine's just arms are popping out of the Spore by John Byrne.
Yep.
And it was much larger than the comic, and it was black and white. And I just didn't understand. And it was in this, big leather portfolio, and it was familiar and foreign at the same time. It was sort of enchanting and a little off-putting and scary at the same time. And then it had a price on it, which I probably didn't understand. It was probably a piece of tape on the top right that said something like 180. It's like, I don't understand this. None of these cues make sense to me. Like, what is this object, and why are people interested in it, and why do I want to get closer? But also, it's sort of weird.
Well, I think I was always a struggling artist as a kid. I think I figured out I liked to draw, and so I think I knew what it was, and I respected the fact that these, I knew there had to be a piece of art out there. Didn't know a lot about the creative process, and I guess collecting original art sort of helped educate me about how, that there could be a different penciler from an inker. There could be, theoretically a separate set of pencils from a separate set of inks, and then the colorists came in after the fact. And so understanding that process, I was educated. There weren't a lot of books on that stuff at the time. I think a little bit later on, how to draw. Well, I guess there was always How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, which was sort of the classic John Buscema book out there. And, I picked up a copy of that, and I think that really explained it to me. But I didn't pick that up probably until after I had discovered original artwork. And then there was the Marvel Tryout book that came out as well, so that you could see the large pages. It actually came with official sort of Marvel stamp pages. So if you wanted to try your hand at becoming an artist, that was the way in the 80s, I think, that most people, sort of played out their dreams and could test their skills on whether or not they were a good enough artist to actually make it into the world of Marvel. I got one of those as a Christmas present one year, but I was just, as a collector, I was like, I don't want to actually touch any of the pages and mess it up. So I'll just leave it in mint condition. So it stayed intact. But it was funny, years later, as I was honing my skills, Mike Zeck decided, he would try to help me out. And I guess what he had done with other artists, and he was like, I will send you photocopies of the original pencils. So if you want to practice inking those. So he sent me the pencils to Punisher #1. And again, I was just kind of like, oh, these kind of look nice as is. I don't know if I want to even get vellum out and start inking these things. So I still have the pencils, so thank you, Mike. And I have the sticky from the 90s, I think, when he sent those to me. But always a little bit of a reluctant artist, and never really got my portfolio together to show Marvel what I could do. But maybe one day.
The other change besides eBay or the internet, sort of people being familiar with comic art or having access to purchase it, there are many more places where comic art is displayed nowadays in museums and galleries. Whereas in the 80s, there were a few shows, or some art might get displayed, not just try to be sold at conventions. But I feel like it's pretty common nowadays, if you're near a certain college or university gallery in a major city, every year or two, there's going to be some kind of show that incorporates original comic art. If not, that is the show.
Yeah, and for those that may have gone to the Marvel Universe of Superheroes exhibit that's traveling the country, I think right now it's in Chicago. That is really the core focus. It shows movie props like the ones I have floating around here side by side with the original artwork, showing sort of the origins of that, to give people greater insights into the creative process and really the fact that this did exist, that there were artists behind this, there was somebody actually, sketching these things out to create these from a blank piece of paper. And that is really the core of the exhibit. And that's something I know I'm contributing some of my non-G.I. Joe stuff to that exhibit as it travels the country. But I've also heard, I'm here in Los Angeles, and there's a number of museums that are starting up this year. You've, of course, got the Academy Museum that's about to open, but you also have the Lucas Museum. And the Lucas Museum has come out and said that there will be a section dedicated to comic art. And I think that's really exciting because they're really focused on telling the narrative story and sort of how that's evolved in different forms of that over the years. And obviously movies, and everybody expects to see, Indiana Jones and Star Wars there. But I think, if you hear the stories, obviously Norman Rockwell was a big influence on Lucas, but I think comic art was also one of the things he early on collected, but also took inspiration from. So it's going to be great to see what collection they have there. And of course, the Library of Congress, if you are in the Washington, D.C. area or can stop by there, has a pretty good selection that people have donated, including the original artwork to Amazing Fantasy 15, which is, frankly, it is a sort of a life-changing experience if you can hold all those pages in your hand of the first appearance of Spider-Man and just page through them and see all the changes that they've made. And I think that's what's crazy about original artwork is sometimes, and we'll see some pages here where the original concept was changed on the fly. We're not talking Transformers today, but if you look at the original art pages for Transformers #1, half those pages I have pages that have completely different dialogue, that have different scenes. They were changing it on the fly, and they were cutting the pages up and pasting things different down because they only had a month to really get that book out, and that the origins of the Transformers as well were created, by a group of folks over at Marvel. And I guess the original concepts didn't fly in some cases, so they had to change it around very quickly. And you'll see a lot of that with G.I. Joe in some of the pages we'll show today as well.
Great. I was gonna say. Chuck, I guess the focus of these kinds of live streams, we've done a few of these now, we've seen people's sort of sketches that they've had done at more on the fly at conventions, the quicker pieces. We've seen the sort of the commissions, and sometimes very ambitious big commissions, and we've seen original art, and then we've also seen things like production art and other sort of curiosities in the sort of G.I. Joe world. It seems like you've gravitated more towards, I guess, the original art that we'd see in the actual book. But perhaps would that be fair to say is that's kind of what you've gravitated towards in both your interest and your collections, that you've less sort of interested in going kind of down commission route?
Yeah, I think I think my focus has been really those first 50 issues of G.I. Joe, because those are the ones that I devoutly read. I think after that it trickled off a little bit, as well as say the Mike Zeck. I guess Mike Zeck continued on to about issue 65 in the regular series, and then the 1 through 8 of the special mission series. So really, my relationship, I think, with Zeck in those sort of those middle 80s years was really sort of it became a tie to G.I. Joe. But over the years, I've also gotten to know, we'll talk about Herb Trimpe. I had a very, great relationship with Herb, and really was, glad to get to know him. And then Mike Vosberg, I've also been, I think you guys may have seen the Mike Vosberg live stream I did recently to help him sell some of his artwork. But Mike and I have known each other over 20 years as well, and just had some great friendships with these folks. So, it's odd being, when you have sort of deep relationships with folks, getting commissions from them is probably the last thing on your mind, because you see all the other people that really want to get commissions, and I feel like they should get them, because I've had the pleasure of really getting to know these people, and that's what they've given back to me. But I've really connected with those early Joe stories. And I guess when I assembled my collection was really looking at, when I started this, nobody really cared about the Joe artwork. Nobody really cared about those early things. And I went out of my way to go and find some of that stuff when nobody else was looking for it. And now I almost look at it as it's the history of the GI Joe characters, and the collection that I have really sort of helps tell the story of the early Joes, if you want to look at it that way. Now, I do have a couple pieces, and we'll talk about a couple pieces from later Joe artists, and I guess nothing as recent as the last even 10 years, but I do have an appreciation when I do see folks like David Michael Beck who sort of put their own spin on drawing some of that, and I do think there's some great artists that are doing it. But as far as my collecting, I've had to sort of focus in my lane and stick with the early Joe quote unquote historic stuff, if you want to look at it that way.
Okay, great. It feels like we're ready to start looking at some art. I'll just say that if people want to send us comments, please do. We'll see those. And so if you've got any questions or comments as we're going along, please feel free to chuck them our way. So let's do this, and we'll get started. So
I like how you threw the chuck in there. It goes nicely with your theme song. Yes.
Okay. Here we go. Here's number 1.
Yeah. So, Tim, back to your question around sort of the original, sort of me starting with getting started collecting original art. Prior to buying my first piece of artwork, I actually got a free sketch, and this is the free sketch that I got from Larry Hama. This, I think, was done in January of 1985. I remember being kind of upset at the time because I was like, oh, if it had only been like a week earlier, he would have signed it 1984 as opposed to 1985 on this. And I think that was around the time G.I. Joe 33 had come out, if I'm not mistaken. But I, again, one of those Washington, D.C. shows, I believe it was in Arlington or in Crystal City, Virginia. It was a show over there, and Larry Hama was the guest. And a friend of mine and I think I had a table, and I was maybe set up next to Larry because I was back in the day. I used to just buy comic collections and sell them. That was sort of my part-time job. And we got stuck next to Larry for the entire show. And my friend, frankly, was a huge G.I. Joe collector. He loved the toys. He loved everything about G.I. Joe. And I, at the time, frankly, didn't know a lot about G.I. Joe. This was sort of my first exposure. So I was kind of the novice. He was the Joe diehard. And, I was like, well, should we, just talk to Larry throughout the show? And so I really that was my appreciation was through just meeting Larry Hama. And at the time, I didn't quite understand the difference between writer and artist and all that. And although Larry was well known for, I guess, writing and creating the characters, I didn't quite understand it. I just assumed he just drew G.I. Joe. And so he's like, hey, if you guys, what sketches do you want? I'm happy to draw you a sketch. And so I chose Scarlet. My friend chose Stalker. And so each of them was drawn on this little notepad, as you can see the little divots from coming out of his notepad there. But he drew me this fantastic sketch of Scarlet, and I was just amazed that somebody could just sort of whip this up so quickly. And Larry was the nicest guy to talk to that day. He really became a hero, taking the time. I think I was maybe 14 at the time, so he taking the time to talk to some teenage kids, for the entire day, and then doing free sketches for us was, going over and above in my book. And, for me, it was like, wow, I guess I should start reading these G.I. Joe comics. And that was that. Now, did I know he had done G.I. Joe 21 and 26? No, not really. I mean, I knew G.I. Joe comics were becoming popular, but I hadn't really read them at the time. So this sketch got me not only into appreciating original comic book art, but also the Joes themselves.
What an introduction.
Yeah,
indeed. Chuck, do you have a recollection of there being a line for people to get signatures, autographs from Hama?
No, it was literally, I don't think any, as popular as G.I. Joe it was becoming at the time, and that was when the book was really sort of taking off from a sales and publication. I think occasional people would come over, but it wasn't that there was, there weren't people with stacks of G.I. Joe books to get signed. And the idea of doing free sketches, or I think the idea of paying for sketches at the time was kind of crazy. No, there really wasn't a line, so that really allowed us to spend almost the entire day talking to Larry. So, and that was the greatest thing.
I note here that this doesn't look much different from Hama's sketches that we see from conventions of the last 3, 5, 10 years. Right. He has this looseness
Yeah.
when he's sketching a drawing like this or laying out a page. either for himself or for the penciler or inker. And, usually when you look at an artist 40 years later, the stuff looks really different. And this looks just a tiny bit different.
Yeah, I think the way he draws Scarlett's eyes, usually he's got more of an eyelash to it nowadays, and there might be some, but I think that the basic sort of, I call this breakdown style, and I think what you see from this is his style, and you have to remember Larry started, although he was a writer, he was working on Iron Fist for Marvel Premiere. I believe it was his first book back in the 70s. So right as soon as the second issue of Iron Fist that had come out, Marvel Premiere 16, was an issue that Larry worked on. And he was also a protege or worked with Neil Adams. And so I think he was working alongside that. But when you see this style and you realize, he drew G.I. Joe 21 and 26 completely, it was in this style. And I think you can also appreciate how much Steve Leialoha had really contributed to finalizing that. And I think if you look at those books, it actually gives him credit for either breakdowns or layouts or something like that, because his style is a lot looser, and Marvel did differentiate, sort of the credits they would give based on the sort of the tightness of the pencil style.
And the pay rate.
Yeah, and the pay rate, I guess, along with that, on how much you had to tighten it up. But, for me, it also showed, like I said, there was this great synergy, and I don't think people give enough credit to Steve Leialoha for really finishing G.I. Joe 21 and 26 and bringing it about to what we remember, and making those two issues really a classic thing. I think they really worked very well together and complemented each other based on Larry's drawing style.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we?
So that was the beginning of the Joes. Yes, or my
Okay. Do you want to segue into the next one?
Yeah. I think with that, I've as part of my collection, I have put a stronger focus on Scarlet. Having that initial tie to getting that sketch with Larry. So years ago, Larry brought out, and this may have been, and Tim, you may remember, it may have been 15 years ago that Larry started going into his personal collection and selling some things. And some of the things that he brought out were these Fury Force drawings. And a lot of discussion around what Fury Force was, how did it contribute to the future of the Joes? And I'd always heard that, I think Layla Galil, I believe is the pronunciation of this, or Lila Galil, that she was the sort of prototype for Scarlet. And when you see this sketch, there's a team sketch out there that shows all the Joes together, but this was the detailed shot of just Lila that was part of the set that he had done. And, it does look a little bit like Scarlet. So when you look at it, and, there's definitely some similarities between what you do. I guess it's partly that it's female, but also because it's also Larry's rougher style, at least with the face there, hard to get a real sense of, is this Scarlet? Is this not Scarlet? And there are some things that, Larry has gone out there and said that, he did use aspects of Lila when he was coming up with Scarlet. But, we'll come up on some other pieces in just a second here that makes me think. So this is dated 1981. And, the idea, for those that don't know, around Fury Force, and correct me if I'm wrong, since you guys also probably know more about it than I do, is Fury Force was something that they were working on, which was supposed to be the son of Nick Fury, and creating a team over at Marvel that was going to sort of carry on the tradition of what Nick Fury had done. And they had created these sets of characters. And there was a character that looked very much like Snake Eyes. There was a character that very much looked like that. So there's some concepts that definitely went across to G.I. Joe. But the question is, from a visual perspective, how much of this, it's always been a question in my mind, is, were these sketches the sort of impetus of what we saw for G.I. Joe? And I guess we'll come across some other ones in just a second that sort of help fill out the story, at least in my mind, as to tell me that although, he did create Lila, probably not necessarily the visual for this visual was the inspiration for what ultimately became Scarlet.
The term that you used, right? Like they were working on Fury Force. To my thinking, it was a pitch.
Yes.
And
yeah,
Larry may have been working on that pitch for weeks or months, but in total, it's like 6 drawings of characters, 2 drawings of vehicles, and a base, and then there's a 2-page typed document, and he pitched it, and editorial said no, or editorial said maybe, and then G.I. Joe came along. So once or twice, someone has like a blog post, or just sort of out there on the internet, someone uses this sort of timing or this phrase. It's like, oh, like G.I. Joe was almost Fury Force, or like Snake Eyes maybe was going to have a hood. It's like, it's much more sort of divergent than that.
I would agree. And I think, I guess when we get to the next one, I did talk to Larry about this and get his perspective at one point when we sat down at another convention. But yeah, I mean, it's still interesting to see what was going on, because again, given the time, remember there were stories in Bizarre Adventures where Herb Trimpe had done sort of a prototype story for the characters that ultimately became the October Guard. And that's a slightly different story. We won't get into that one today. But there was a lot of just pitches and short stories that were going on in various black and white Marvel magazines and other places, and it was about to be the birth of the limited series that was going on in 1982 over at Marvel as well, with Contest of Champions and Wolverine and Hercules and all those other things that were going on. So the idea that creators were pitching these ideas and concepts that could become comics, wasn't far-fetched, and it was probably happening all the time. But just an interesting thing, because I mean, interesting to see what sort of happened with Nick Fury as a character, and it would have been interesting to see if Nick Fury did have a son, and maybe it still will become something one day. I do think that Fury Force is stuck in people's minds for one reason or another, and there's always a chance that the Fury Force may come back.
Yeah, it's things as well, like the specificity of the weaponry and things like that. So like
I used to own all the
weaponry.
I used to have all the sketches of that. There's another local collector here that was interested in those, so I let him add those to his collection. But yeah, the Lila one, I think for me in the history of Scarlet was something that was important to get and keep, and I think it's interesting to showcase as part of the origin of the character, because I do think, regardless of everything else, there were some concepts that Larry was developing in his mind around the character that did translate to ultimately how he had thought about Scarlet.
Okay, and then this next image we'd included for you, to talk to the point about actually where the look of Scarlet came from and when. Yes.
So when I talked to Larry and said, "Hey, was this the first thing of first drawing of Scarlet?" He basically said no. He said the look and feel was all Ron Rudat, and so Ron Rudat's designs for the characters were really what everything was based off of. I created the dossiers and sort of the story behind the characters, but he gave credit to Ron for designing all this. And again, looking at the dates, and it's interesting that Larry did date the other drawing, 1981. This Ron Rudat's drawings, and this is something I took from. And I don't own this piece for anybody that's interested. This was off of the Toys That Made Us, but Ron Rudat signed this in 1980, and you see all the different characters there for the toy designs, and there's Scarlet at the end. So she definitely had the look and feel of the toy itself, and that's what not only Larry was looking at, but Herb and other folks as they were looking at the characters. These were the original designs for the characters, and this is the original Scarlet. At least there may have been other Scarlets that Ron drew as well, but his were the designs that really defined the Scarlet character.
It's worth remembering with the creation of Scarlet that if you have a team of men with one woman in 1982, and this is going to be a toy, this is going to be a comic, and there's an eye that this might be television, out of all the different types and colors and costume combinations you could come up with for this woman, it's pretty narrow what several comics and toy and marketing and later animation people would pick. And so part of what I find so fun about sort of Rudat creates the visual and is that it is coincidental that Larry has this female character on this team that he's been pitching, that he had pitched to Marvel. And, they don't look alike because Hama had seen these early Scarlet drawings from Rudat. Right. They look alike because it's like, Well, she's not going to have some crazy helmet where you can't see her face. She's probably not going to have a buzz cut. And like, what are the things in culture that are influencing design in 1980, 81, 82? You know, it's like Star Wars and Vietnam and
Farrah Fawcett, there was the flowing hair.
Yeah. So, if you had, I don't say this in any way to diminish what Rudat or Hama did, but if you were to take like a room full of artists and writers and designers, and in 1980, and you're like, come up with a woman to join this action team, it's like there's only so many permutations that are likely.
Yeah, that reminds me of an interesting story that my exec told me about the origins of the black costume Spider-Man, which is, there's a rumor out there that somebody wrote in a letter and they were the person that sort of came up with the idea of the black Spider-Man costume. Totally false. What Mike said is that Shooter came to him one day and said, hey, you need to design a new Spider-Man costume. And Mike was like, well, spiders are black. If you have to design a costume, it's pretty obvious that and you're starting from scratch. If you were to design a spider costume, it probably should be black. And he really designed it from there. So there really was no, as much as other people want to take credit for it, there really wasn't that conversation of like the direction of like, hey, we got this great idea from a reader on doing that.
But coincidentally, there was a letter, right? And then last year, Marvel commissioned a story where they had, was it like Roger Stern and Rick Leonardi do a story as if that version. Sorry, this is a tangent.
Yeah, I don't know if they did do that, but again, I've talked to Mike and Jim, and again, it was, I'm sure at the time people were sending in story ideas all the time, and they like to think that they did that. But for Mike, who was the person commissioned to design the black costume, and Mike's memory on that was pretty good. There was never any discussion that there was something coming from a reader that, and they didn't, purchase it or not. So I think it's over time, everything's evolved, and the fact that the black costume has become so important. And it as you were saying, I think that was my point, which is coincidentally at the time, it's like if you were to create a story, it can all happen, and other people can have that same idea. It was not brain science to figure out that a black costume Spider-Man could exist, or that was a cool design for the costume, because that's what everybody would have designed at that point in time if you gave them a blank slate and said, go design a spider costume. So, But anyway, that's a tangent. So.
Scarlet, G.I. Joe.
What's the next slide, Mark?
Yeah, we're on the Scarlet thread. So
yeah,
let's hear about this.
Yeah. So again, when Larry had decided to part with things, some of the very cool things he parted with were his original hand typed dossiers for each of the characters. So this is really Larry putting the first thoughts together as to who these characters were. And what's really cool is to see early 1980s corrections, because he was using a typewriter that didn't even have the correction function. Yeah. You couldn't do it on a computer, and so you see these handwritten corrections on with typos that were in there of that. But I think that this really, as far as Larry's contribution to the characters, this is where it started, which is he would put down on paper based on his own experience, having been in the military, what their background should be, and really giving insights into those characters and bringing them to life. And this is, as we'll show here, this is what's translated into the backs of each of the cards that were on the toys itself. But I think if you scroll down too, it's interesting. I don't know, I didn't look at this one. Like, did they this one doesn't have it, but some of them actually quote, like they have like other, excerpt from, R. Carosella. I don't know who that is, but that was probably somebody that Larry knew. Like he was using like Marvel editors and other people as the people that, these excerpts and quotes were coming from. So it is interesting when you see some of those other dossiers that's there. But again, just this is it. This is Larry's creation of Scarlet. And it's also interesting too is that if you see at the top, the number on it is number 13. So Scarlet really was sort of the last Joe that he went to go create, or at least sort of come up with as far as the creation of that. So I think he did them in order, and I assume it was probably based off of Rudat's designs. He probably went character by character. I haven't actually done the analysis to figure that out and sort of cross
right in that maybe that same
Yeah, it could be. I have some of the other ones, so I
Well,
guess I should go back and check that now that I've even sort of thought about that.
That previous slide where we see all 13, that is a photocopy of 13 separate drawings.
Oh, is that okay?
Yeah, comped onto, because I have photocopies of each of those individual drawings.
Gotcha.
Our viewers probably know this, but Hama wrote these to keep the characters separate for himself in his own mind. And when Hasbro marketing saw these, they said, "Oh, those are great." And Hasbro and there had been this idea sort of percolating at Hasbro to add some kind of value to the toy or packaging. And what came about was these dossiers. And so the ones that are printed on the backs are edited versions of these because they're a little too long. And then it became the annual part of the toy line.
Yeah, I mean, and for people that bought those early toys, I mean, cutting these out and collecting these was a brilliant idea from a marketing standpoint as well, but also just added so much interest and a personality to a plastic toy that had just come out. You suddenly get to know the character so well, and it feels very thought out and detailed. And I think it started with Hama's original, as you say, they condensed it down from an even more detailed version of that. But that brilliant things that just were not done prior to that in toys.
Chuck, it sounds like you don't have a strong relationship with the G.I. Joe toy line of that time.
I do not. I, again, never have bought a G.I. Joe toy, strangely enough. I have giant ones behind me.
How many of the how many toys have been given to you by someone who just wanted to find the link, just the right figure, just the right vehicle?
The only toy that has been given to me was I got one of the mail-in Cobra Commanders that a friend of my friend that went with me to the convention. I think I got it from his collection. Of course, it's now like the rubber bands have exploded on it, so it's in pieces. But that's the only GI Joe toy I have ever owned. Strangely enough, as big of a GI Joe fan, I've had in my mind that I would like to go back and buy like mint condition or really nice condition toys of the original lineup, but I have never gone back and done it, partly because I'm a little scared that they're going to blow up, that the rubber bands are going to break at some point. So I don't want to end up with toys that are going to explode in the packaging. But yeah, strangely enough, I was more tied to the comics and the artwork than I was the actual toys themselves. So.
And on the comments, Diana chips in and reminds us of the fact that at one point they didn't want to pay Larry to do these file cards anymore and decided to do them in-house. I think his description was, to some young intern, and where they were always the best of the best at everything. And they quickly learned the difference between a marketer and an artist and decided to pay him again.
Yeah, there's some middle years, and then certainly at the end of Real American Hero, you can tell which ones are. There's some that might be Larry Hama. There's some that are a Hasbro person rewriting an earlier Larry Hama one, and there's some that are they're fun. They're just definitely not Larry Hama.
Yeah. The late I do have other dossiers. I think the latest one I have is for the fridge because I just thought that one was funny, and that one is actually. That is actually not typed. That one's actually on a sort of a computer that he printed out. It was the only one that he only printout he kept. But it's interesting to even see the progression that he moved from like an old style typewriter to a dot matrix printer.
I was looking at this one because the bulk of that original typed file card is actually what made it onto the published version on the back of the card, apart from this extra peer personality assessment at the bottom. And it's it's great and of its time. I've got to admit, I was as leery.
Was Robert Graves mentioned in G.I. Joe 1 for some reason, or was there a file of Robert Graves somewhere? I feel like I've seen that name somewhere. Grunt, okay.
That's Grunt's file's name, yeah. So this is Grunt describing her. Yeah, I was leery as the other guys about having a woman on the team, especially one as foxy as her. But after the first mission, with us, everything was copacetic. Yeah, excellent stuff.
Well, of the time period. So,
okay, should we move on to the next one? Wow.
Yeah. So this, again, I got to know Herb Trimpe very well in his later years and helped him with some of his sketchbooks that he would take to conventions. And obviously GI Joe was something I loved to talk to him about. And while he was still alive, he had mentioned to me that he had done a number of designs before he got to GI Joe 1. So when he took on the GI Joe project, obviously the GI Joe 1 cover was used as part of the pitch process. But when he went to go sort of translate the toys, the Ron Rudat designs, he had to create the faces and other things for the characters that may not have been as distinct in the toys themselves. So he went through an exercise of drawing each of the characters in this sort of format. But in this set of drawings, he told me he wanted to do a version of it that was more military-like. He didn't frankly like the idea that the original costumes were not standard military, and you wouldn't really ever see that having come from a military background. And so the set of the original Joes that he had done, he had sort of taken a different spin on them, or a slightly different spin. And you'll notice Scarlett's costume here is very different than the toy itself, and ultimately the one that was drawn. So, I think he showed these to Marvel as part of sort of the creative process, and he always expressed disappointment to me. He was like, "Yeah, they kind of shot it down." And they basically said, "Nope, stick with the toy designs." And so he had to go back to drawing the toy designs later on. But I think what did stick relative to these designs is sort of the faces that you see on these. So this is obviously the way that he was drawing Scarlett in GI Joe '1 from that perspective. So there was some aspect of that, but
also,
great to see this. Yeah. This early.
And also, at some point, they decided to give her the ponytail as well, which wasn't on the figure.
That was Herb's, I guess. Because if you're going to put it in a helmet, you can't just have it free flowing. And I think the ponytail, and again, this is probably his own experience having been in the military, and maybe for the folks that were in the military that were female that he knew, putting it in a ponytail made more sense to him. So that's maybe why he gave it that look.
And as we record this in early July 2021, the rules for how women can keep their hair in the military just changed last month. There's more flexibility, because if you have a bun and you have a helmet, your hair gets pulled back and you can have a lot of headaches. Yeah. I'm really struck in this drawing by how pretty the pencils are.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Trimpe's work, we so rarely see the pencils because, he created such a volume of comics over 30 some years that we're used to the inks and then, how it's published in color. And there are other artists from whom seemingly a lot of photocopies of pencils, like Mike Zeck and Jack Kirby, they're in the fan publications. A lot of these photocopies of pencils are out there, and not so much with Trimpe. And so it's a real delight to see all the work he's doing here in the textures, in hair, in clothing folds, like leather for pouches, and a little bit of mechanical for her weapons.
Yeah, I think, and I think it's a good thing is that you can see a contrast between Hama's style and Trimpe's style in drawing. Very, I think Herb focused on the black and whites and really having those shadows, and I think you saw a lot of that with Kirby as well. And there's obviously a Kirby influence when Trimpe joined Marvel in the '60s. I think he was trying to emulate a little bit of what Kirby was doing since he was the dominant style. But in 1982. Which is a little later in his career, to have these such tight pencils, it shows that he was taking a real big interest in this project. And I think he was, genuinely excited to sort of translate and actually have a military team that he was about to draw. And so I think he took his time with each of these drawings that he had done of each of the different characters and try to figure out, how do I make these distinct and how do I make them stand out as characters, given that it was an ensemble cast that they needed to bring together here. So really impressive behind the scenes things, and a little bit of history on these is that, I hadn't actually seen any of these until unfortunately after he had died. And then, I got to know the family a little bit better, and I had found out that I guess earlier he had given different drawings to different folks in the family, and they were all kind enough to sort of allow me to purchase a lot of these, knowing how big of a G.I. Joe art fan I was. and try to sort of reassemble the cast, so to speak, of the different characters. But he even felt they were so special that, frankly, of the artwork that he kept, these original Joe sketches were something that he thought was important to maintain. So I'm glad I could be the keeper of them now, and obviously, hopefully for future generations to sort of study these and really see these early or versions of the Joe characters and how they evolve from here.
Mm-hmm. And there's a delicateness and detail to these illustrations that you don't always necessarily see in the printed work. And I guess part of that is the production process, that the paper that's being used and the printing methods that were being used at the time. And I wonder, would we have seen a very different kind of Herb Trimpe to if they had some of the technologies of today, where he could have included a lot more of these sort of fine details on the paper and seen that.
Well, and I think when we get to looking at his artwork, I think here's an early example. We'll talk more about his special missions artwork. I think when you see that special missions art, it is really detailed. I mean, it's really a different. It's a finer line. The line work on it is super detailed. And if you go back and look at that, I really think that was Herb's chance to break out and do more of a fine art book. I think in the early Joe books, it was, we've got to do something that's a little bit more commercial. It's a little bit more model. And so it was a little bit more blocky. But by the time they got to special missions, it was, let's tell stories in the real world. And at the time, he was working on another book, Savage Tales, where if you look at the work that he did in that Savage Tales magazine, it's probably some of his finest work. Herb goes all out. Now, not characters that people know or care about, frankly, but the artwork in it is just fantastic. And I think that's part of it, is a lot of people, may not be true, fans of looking for all of Herb's work. But if you can find those early Savage Tales magazines, you'll see really Herb at his finest. But I think a lot of that got translated to those early special missions issues that he was working on. When you look back on issues 1 and 2, and, he's doing the pencils and the inks himself, versus having in issue 1 of G.I. Joe, Bob McLeod was actually the inker. And when you see the original pencils for G.I. Joe 1, it's very much like this, but Bob actually softened it. And I'm sure he got some direction from folks at Marvel to sort of, not make it look as, sort of Trimpy as it is, and not as blocky, but sort of smooth out some of that and add that. But Bob has a very dominant inking style where the Bob McLeod shows. And I think you see that in G.I. Joe 1, which set a little bit of a different pace. But when you look at, say, G.I. Joe's, I think 7, I believe it was, where Chick Stone is inking him. Chick is, he was one of the Kirby inkers. And so I think when you see issue 7 of G.I. Joe, you'll see a more true version of sort of Trimpe's pencils reflected in G.I. Joe 7 versus, say, G.I. Joe number 1.
Okay, very good. Sorry, Tim, was there something else that you wanted to say before I flick on to the next one?
No, let's keep going.
Okay, all right. So, okay, the next one, I think it's kind of needs a drum roll, and I don't know where we'll go from here, because it's such a pinnacle. But I'll just click onto it and be, set ready to set your faces to stun.
So speaking of Bob McLeod and G.I. Joe 1, this is the, I guess, the money shot, so to speak, of all the original Joes being introduced for the first time, at least by name, in the pages of G.I. Joe number 1. So, I don't know exactly what to say. No, I think what I would say about this one is, starting with, again, you can see where we looked at Herb's original pencils, and I think is at panel 4 there, you can see sort of a feel of it. But panel 3 really just does not feel very Trimpy, frankly. You can see a lot more Bob McLeod in the inking. I think you see the Zipatone that was used in the 1980s being used on this page, again, to sort of give it a more modern look and feel versus a 1960s feel that had that. And even the way you can sort of see his cheeks being inked there, this is very much Bob. And so I see more of Bob there than I do of Herb's original pencils. And I think I don't have copies of the original pencils. I do believe actually Bob did keep those original pencils, so they are out there, but or copies of the pencils, let me say. But but yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of see the style change between Herb's original style and what ended up in the pages of GI Joe #1. But great introduction. You got a nice Cobra banner in the background in the first panel there, leading up to sort of the money shot at the bottom, which is okay. Let's get to know each of these Joes and look at each of these Joes. And a few things I'll point out on this one, which is I think it's the unknown Joe that was never released in the bottom right corner that always gets me attention and sort of a laugh, which is Shooter. And you guys would know, have they ever come out with a Shooter figure?
Yes.
Yep.
They did. Okay.
They had a big backstory for Shooter and the reveal of the character in G.I. Joe Declassified. So they sort of Larry did come up with a Shooter to kind of explain who this mystery Joe actually was.
And awesome. And again, I think it's worth pointing out, I don't have proof. This is a guess on my part. This is a joke because Jim Shooter is the editor-in-chief. And
yeah.
And this isn't like Hama or the letterer, and the letterer would not have taken matters into their own hands. But this is not someone, I don't think this is someone trying to create potential for a 14th member. This is a joke because on the top right of the panel, you can see the first letter of the 15th Joe, who seems to be bald. I think it's Baldy.
Yeah, B for Baldy, maybe. Yeah.
So this is, and you read comics, you read Marvel comics from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and people get nicknames in the credits, Smilin' Stan and Jolly Jack. Sometimes there'd be a fill-in artist, and the credits would say, it's like Jack Kirby will be back next month, but we welcome John Buscema for a fill-in this month, and we welcome so-and-so as the new regular artist. Here's a talent, and then wrapping it all together in a bow is our editor so-and-so. And here and there, that kind of jokey celebration could sort of leak up onto the first page or into the story. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby show up in an issue of Fantastic Four. So this is a throwaway gag, which in a 3-issue miniseries 25 years later, Larry Hama went back to.
Yeah. No, I do agree that would be my guess as well, is that they were always trying to make fun of Jim Shooter for different things, and he might get a kick out of it as well. But yeah, I think what's interesting about this though is looking at the corrections, and I think this is where the corrections start. If you see other pages from GI Joe 1, you'll see a lot of these same corrections all the way through, because when Trimpe had designed some of these characters or done those original designs, I guess they changed. They decided to change sort of on the fly at the very last minute and add some details to each of the different characters that made them a little bit more distinct. And Tim, you may have more insight as to whether or not it was due to toy changes and things that they were doing in the production of it, or if it had more to do with just sort of aligning around what the comic book characters would look like. But as you'll see, there's notes at the bottom, which is Clutch beard. So Clutch originally did not, they had to add the beard to that. So originally he did not have a beard. Rock and Roll, full beard, so they added a full beard to Rock and Roll. And then they had changed, it looks like, the name of Stalker from, they originally probably had lettered in Ranger and decided to go Stalker. And so, just on this page, and then the big change is Snake Eyes, which is, they hadn't aligned around what Snake Eyes had fully looked like when Trimpe had penciled this issue. And so they ultimately had to sort of go back and correct all the Snake Eyes figures in the issue.
Yeah, this is so subtle. I want to say it out loud. Everyone, the paper has yellowed just a tiny bit, but if you look at Snake Eyes, the white inside Snake Eyes is a cooler, brighter white, like whiteout, like correction fluid.
That is correct.
So that he has been redrawn.
So he has been completely redrawn from the original look and feel of Snake Eyes to this, which is, I guess, the aligned on for the very last thing. But and same thing for Stalker. You'll see that was whited out as well, and it's a very subtle difference in color versus the other ones there as well.
When you look at for our viewers, when you look at original art, half the time or 3/4 of the time, if you see it something like Stalker's Name and you see that it's sitting on top of whiteout, half the time it's not a change because the script changed or it's based on a toy and they're figuring it out. Half the time it's because the letterer made a small error and left a word out or misspelled something, and the editor or the spell checker just corrected it. And sometimes in non-photo blue pencil, also called copy not pencil, sometimes the correction, like an arrow, is just drawn right across the artwork and pointing to the offending error, and that blue does not get picked up when at Marvel they photograph the black and white artwork onto film. So when you see corrections like this, sometimes it is exciting, as what Chuck is talking about right now, and sometimes it's like, oh, that word was misspelled.
Yes, that is true, and I think these are interesting in that it shows that the corrections were made after. Again, the process is Trimpe would have penciled it. He would have mailed them over to Bob McLeod. Bob McLeod would have inked them on the same page on the original art that had Trimpe's pencils, and then it would have been sent into Marvel sort of for final approval. Typically, the letterer, I'm not sure where the lettering was done on this, but I do think it was lettered either after Trimpe had penciled it as well. But that shows me that these corrections all came in after McLeod had finished his job inking it, and that somebody had gone back probably in the offices and made these corrections. So I'm not even 100% sure. I don't think I've ever asked Bob this, if he made the corrections or if one of the editorial folks at Marvel had gone in and sort of changed all the Snake Eye images and added the beards and to the characters.
For viewers who know about the Marvel bullpen, the Marvel bullpen is where the editors have offices, the publisher and the president are upstairs making business decisions, and there are production people who are dealing with photographing the artwork, storing those films, right? In effect, the copies, wrangling like all the color information to send those off to the place that's going to do the color film. And some of these people in the bullpen are artists, and they're the ones that do the corrections. And every so often, if the inker is dropping off pages for some other comic or the next issue, the editor could say, can you do a fix on this page from your last issue? But often it was just, one of like 5 people in the office. It's like, oh, we need you to redraw this head. We need you to black out this helicopter because the helicopter needs to show up in the next panel, that kind of thing.
That is correct.
Diana's put in a comment as well. Who's next to Hawk and Zap? So to the left of Hawk and Zap looks like there's more blurb coming along. So hinting at some other people on that screen.
You know what this means?
Well.
This means I want another Larry Hama miniseries.
Exactly, that's what it means.
The Baldy Initiative.
Maybe early origins of Duke and Roadblock or something like that. I don't know. Maybe they knew they were coming.
I was going to make a joke that doesn't work. What is our next? I love this. What is our next slide?
Okie dokie. Let's
so we just get to it.
Yeah, let's do it.
It's moving on. We're going to go numerical in order from G.I. Joe 1 to...
Here we go.
G.I. Joe 2. So collecting, again, the pages from the early books. So we moved from issue 1, which was drawn by Herb Trimpe. And I guess, people sometimes forget, I'm sure the diehard Joe fans don't, is that there was a backup story in G.I. Joe 1 as well. It doesn't always get reprinted when the story from G.I. Joe 1 gets reprinted, but it was a 10-page story called Hot Potato. And so it's interesting in that there really were 2 artists that were the first to draw G.I. Joe. I think Trimpe, obviously you can see from the character designs, was the person that was designing sort of the look and feel of the characters for the comics. But Perlin was also the other artist that was drawing at the time. And so while Trimpe was drawing issue 1, Perlin got the assignment of drawing issue 2, which it's interesting I think sometimes people forget that they were sort of trading off between Trimpe and Perlin for a lot of those stories. So Perlin drew issues 2 and 5 completely and then had the backup story in 1, while Herb had drawn 1, 3, 4, 6, and 7. And you guys may have talked about it on others, but 6 and 7 were originally supposed to be 3 and 4. and then they ended up getting held up because of editorial changes. But issue 2, again, a personal favorite. I just thought the storytelling on this particular issue blew me away. Frankly, as a comic book collector, not being, sort of the person that read these I actually did buy issue 1 off the stands. It's sort of an interesting story. Is I was visiting my grandparents when issue 1 came out, so I went to the spinner rack and bought issue 1 along with maybe a Team America 2 or something that came out that month. And then as a kid, I left my comics at the airport when we were changing planes, and so I never got to read. That was like the big disappointment. So I never got to read G.I. Joe 1. I had bought it, and it was $1.50. It was not cheap as a kid. I had to save up for that issue. And I was so disappointed. I was like, I can't spend another $1.50 to buy that book. I guess I'll just have to read it later. So then I remember G.I. Joe 2, but I was so I guess so heartbroken after not being able to read G.I. Joe 1. I just sort of gave up on reading them when they were hitting the newsstand. So I didn't read G.I. Joe 2 until it became a $40 comic book. I mean, for collectors back in the 80s, you knew that G.I. Joe 2 was the quote unquote hard one to get. So I actually had to read it as a back issue when it was a quote expensive back issue. But the storytelling on this, I was blown away on just how great this particular issue was. And it really, for me, culminated with just the visuals in that last couple of panels. That it really just, talked about, this page really talks about sort of Quinn's sense of morality and really what that meant to him. And, I would say the surprise twist ending, he sort of knew what was coming. And just to see those last couple of panels sort of come to fruition with Snake Eyes wearing Quinn's necklace was, I'd never seen storytelling quite like that. And so when I saw the original art, I always wondered, I was like, that last panel looks a lot like, they just redrew the panel to the left of it. Is it, a photostat or is it not? And a photostat is a reproduction on a special photographic paper that they would make back around that time frame. And when you actually blow it up there, Mark, if you want to blow that up, you can actually see it is in fact a photostat in that last panel that they just blew up. But even from a sense of storytelling, to say that we want to focus in and make sure the readers, the last thing that they're left with is the realization that Quinn had left the necklace and Snake Eyes had found the necklace, and now it's over for these two. Just an amazing way to end a story, and for a quote unquote toy comic book, it was this to me proved it was one of the best written books at the time.
So we are looking at a stat. That final panel is a reproduction of the second to last. Have you? It
is. You can sort of see the texture if you look at if you look at Snake Eyes' face. That's because of the stat. And I guess when you actually have the art in person, you can actually see it. I may actually have the art next to me. Let me see.
Chuck, have you pulled this panel off?
I have not. Let me. I actually have the page here, but let me pull it out to see if
are they both stats on the bottom? Because they're both pretty.
It's interesting. This looks like the whole last part. Like this is
the bottom.
You can see it. It's
the
sort
bottom
of
tier.
The bottom tier was replaced.
Okay.
And now that I look at it, it's interesting. Now that I look at it up front, this is actually a stat.
Yeah. Okay.
The top part is a stat. The bottom part was hand drawn, and then this is full stat. This part down here was hand drawn, but on the back of it, you can sort of see the note, which is 1 positive at 80%. So, I am using the light right now as I look at this to see if the original art was behind it or if it was drawn on maybe a separate page. Hard for me to see. I guess if I shine a light, it was. I can see it now. It's funny when you have the art, you can sort of see through it if there's a strong enough light. The panel was originally drawn larger. You can sort of see Scarlett's face was a lot larger, and they covered over that with the photostat. They actually shrunk it down. So that they could fit all 4 of them in there.
Was the idea that what we were seeing as the second to last panel filled the space of the final 2 panels, and in shrinking it, they wanted to create?
I think that may be it, because Scarlett's head definitely looks a lot bigger, and so it looks like they rejiggered
so that you could have the final panel.
Yes. Well, I'd have to actually shine a really bright light to see if it's all under there. But I do believe I think I see over here. You guys can't see it. I believe I see. Is that Stalker? Maybe no. Could be Stalker. But yeah, there's definitely there's definitely work underneath there that they covered up with the photo stat. I guess they decided it was more dramatic to do the close up at the very end of it. So.
Wow.
It's funny. I haven't pulled that page out in a number of years to look at it in detail. And even the picture of the, of all of them together in sort of the far away shot, that is also a stat. So I think they played around with visually how to end the story of, sort of going from a very far away shot to a pretty up close shot to a very up close shot at the end, and just figured that was the best way of doing it. Is here you're realizing, or here you're realizing, okay, the Joes have made it through. Oh, now you sort of see them all together, and now it's like focus in on the important part of that picture, which is the fact that Snake Eyes is wearing the necklace, and you know what's coming next. So, just again, blown away on just the storytelling, the way to do that. And the funny thing is too, no words. I mean, when you look at those last two panels, no words at all. You don't need the words to tell the story.
Yeah, this
on
is
this ultra close version. I think you can even see a thumbprint or fingerprint or something over on Snake Eyes' face here from the person.
And you can also see the line
down
right below Snake Eyes' hands there of where the original art is drawn and where the photostat was. So they covered over that.
Yeah, so the original drawing, they're cropped at their waists, and all four heads and torsos are much bigger, which fills the two rectangles of these final panels. But in order to in shrinking that drawing to fit now as a second to last panel, and then diminish the headroom so there isn't space above their heads where you think there should be word balloons, you then have to draw in their pelvises and a bit of their legs. So these word balloons are yellow, so these must be cut out and rubber cemented.
Yeah, so that's typically done. That is correct. That's typically done when they're in a rush and they haven't, as I said previously, the typical process is pencil first, then send it over to the letterer. The letterer then will put in the words, and then the inker will finalize the drawings around it. In this case, that shows that they had to take the pencils, send them over to the inker, who was Jack Abel at the time. Jack would have inked everything, and then I guess they were still working on finalizing the story, and then so they just had somebody work on the word balloons on vellum, so they would have had overlays of the pencils, and then they were working in parallel on that, and then they would just cut it out and paste them over at the end. But yeah, from an original art perspective, it gets messy because those word balloons, they flake off and get lost all the time.
Yeah,
so it's a nightmare.
Rubber cement does not hold its adhesion for 40 years. I have a much later G.I. Joe page where a couple word balloons fell off, and so I used some archival double-sided acid-free tape to stick the word balloons back on, and I felt both excited to be saving and restoring the art, and also a little bit like I was violating it.
Yeah, I mean, for those types of projects, I have an art restorer here in California that I trust to do that. But you're right. And unfortunately, original art was not made. They were making it that month to get it out the door. It was not made to last as a fine piece of artwork. And so sometimes you have to do things to the artwork to help preserve it for a few more years. And frankly, in some cases, it might be smart for me to have all those removed and then deacidified and then put back on, but I don't necessarily have the heart to do it myself. But I think there does get to a point where you've also got to help protect the art and make sure that it can last for generations to come.
What's the can you zoom in 1, 2, 3, 4? Mark, can you zoom in next to panel 4? There's something written sideways on the right gutter.
It says to your.
So that's an example, Tim, I think, of where they probably wrote YOU''RE and corrected it to say
yes,
YOUR. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
You've got the Y to your is whited out there, and there's, I guess, the editorial requesting that change.
Yeah, spell check didn't exist as easily back in 1982.
I have seen a Larry Hama script or two where there is an apostrophe where there need not be one, or a missing one where there should be one. But that is the process, right? Like the editors fix the mistakes, and the letterers are checking the mistakes, and the proofreaders are checking the mistakes.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember when, this is a monthly book, so everybody, and sometimes a penciler might have 2 books to do a month, and same thing for a writer. So I'm not sure if Larry was writing anything else at the time, but you may have a week, maybe it took a week to write the script, or maybe even just a few days. So focusing on spelling and all the rest of that stuff was probably not the biggest priority. It was getting the main product off to the next person so that they could work on their piece of this. So.
What is our next slide?
Next slide.
We do jump. We do that. We go to I guess issue 10. But what I wanted to illustrate here is, and I'm not sure how many people, I'm sure the diehard Joes know that Larry, for many of the covers, actually created the layouts, and so he would hand an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper to the artist who is actually scheduled to draw the cover. And this is one of the rare examples of Larry's hand-drawn cover layouts for issue 10. As far as I know, and Tim, you may know of others that exist, I've only heard of 3 of these that still exist. There was issue 9, issue 10, and issue 24, which was a Mike Zeck cover. So 2 of them are Vosberg's, and one is Zeck. And this actually came from Mike Vosberg. It was funny. I was over at his house, and he's like, "Hey, look what I just found." This was probably 3-4 years ago. He's like, "I found these sketches," and he's like, "I'm sending them." He's like, "These are Larry's original sketches that he had sent me to draw the cover to G.I. Joe's 9 and 10." And I was like, "Well, Mike, what are you going to do with them?" He's like, "Well, they're Larry's, so Larry can decide what he's going to do with them because I'm going to return them to Larry." And I was like, but wait, I've been looking for something like this all my life, Mike. So he got me in touch with Larry so that I could purchase them directly back from Larry. But it was great that Mike, felt because it wasn't his artwork that he, because he found it, he was going to return them to Larry. And thank you to Larry for actually allowing me to purchase them from him. But I think it's just, you don't see these. Most of the, I talked to Mike Zeck, and I was like, "Mike, what did you do with all your sketches?" He's like, "Honestly, I probably threw them away because, there was really no reason to keep them at the time." But the funny thing is, too, you can see a little bit of a crease. It was actually folded up and probably sent in like a regular envelope to before the days. You can sort of see 2 creases if you look at it, because it was probably just mailed in a regular envelope over to Vosberg so that he could draw the cover for this, because they obviously didn't have. And it's right underneath the Real American Hero logo, I believe.
So to point out the obvious, since medium gray and dark gray can sort of feel the same, these are original pencils drawn onto an 8.5 by 11 photocopy of the empty rectangle with the logo.
That is correct.
And to answer your question, Chuck, I know of at least one more because I own Hama's cover sketch for issue 30.
Oh, great.
What?
Great. For breaking news, folks. Breaking news. Hopefully Tim will show it on a future episode. But
well, it is in my book, so someday everyone will see it.
Everybody will see it. That's great. I did not know another Zeck had made it out there.
There is one more in the wild that only was made public, I think, last week, very, very recently. Issue 37, which is the one
Zeck
of Flint jumping off the armadillo tank onto one of the Crimson Twins on the roller coaster, which is I posted that the other day on the Talking Joe Facebook page, so head over there if you want to see it. I can't off the top of my head remember the credit, but yeah, it's there on the Facebook page and also on Instagram if you do want to track it down.
So in looking at this blow up here, I think a lot of times fans of Larry Hama, we take for granted that his stories are entertaining and his characterization is compelling in a long-running series like G.I. Joe. And then sometimes we remember that, issues 21 and 26 are really well drawn and that the storytelling is really great. And what I think sometimes gets lost, and Chuck makes a great point earlier in this episode, that Larry started as an artist. in comics. And even before the second appearance of Iron Fist in Marvel Premiere, he was drawing for other publications. Is that Hama's visual storytelling? I don't mean just like sequentially, like, oh, you know what's happening in issue 21 without the words. I mean his ability to compose an image and to populate it with characters that are in poses that tell the story. And again, I think people sometimes get sort of confused on sort of what story is, because they're thinking of a script or a plot, like words in a row that says what happens. But for this cover, right, and there aren't a lot of comics that have covers like this, right? This cover, it tells a story in one image, right? So you and yes, there's a little bit of a cheat because there's wording in that sign, and in this case, there's dialogue which doesn't show up in the final. But everyone's pose is supporting this idea, right? That the two Joes are like, they're doing fine. Scarlet looks happy or excited, and even though Snake Eyes' pose looks a little bit like he's creeping along, there isn't tension. They're not like sliding up on the other side of that fake house the way that this full-bodied Cobra soldier is, right? And we see this happens in issue 21 a bunch. We see just enough of this second Cobra soldier on this cover to get the idea that there is a second Cobra soldier and maybe more, without Hama, A, having to draw the full body, and B, taking up valuable space, which is better spent on the texture of the wood, on the bush, the other bush, all the negative space around Scarlet, behind Snake Eyes, right? Like, we need to see that other house. We need to see an indication of another house behind it. So again, story isn't just words in a Word document or words on a typewritten page. And story isn't just descriptions of like sequential panels. Story is this much bigger, like uber thing that is both the ideas, the character, the change, the words, and the art all and the color all together. And Hama is, like we see that the Scarlet sketch that we started with, it's like, that's a good drawing. This guy can draw people, even if his style is sort of old school, it's loose, it's breakdowns, right? And you look at this, and if I was a cover artist and my editor said, oh, you're going to draw the cover to G.I. Joe 10. And I said, okay, what do I draw? And then they said, oh, well, we're going to mail you something. I would be so grateful that all of the problems have been solved. And now I can just worry about the time it's going to spend me to actually like do the pencil mileage to move my hand, right? Like, this composition is great because of the story, because of the spacing, the design, the poses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of the
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say all of the examples that we've seen where Larry has done these very the classic era G.I. Joe covers, it's all there, just the composition and it's still just then the honing it down and tightening it up. But actually, as you say, the sort of solving the puzzle of producing an incredible composition. What is where? It's all there on the page already. It's very evident from seeing this and the other examples of those prelims from Larry, what a great visual storyteller he is.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, to your point. People give credit to Mike Zeck and others, and not to say Mike's not a great artist, but it starts with Larry's layouts for these things, which is some of these designs is like coming up with the concept, and coming up with that is the other artist can really tighten it up and add something to it, and it makes it, as Tim was saying, it's like if you got like sort of the work done for you to solve the problem of sort of how to pull all this together, then you can focus your energy on making the cover just look fantastic. And I think that's what Zeck does in a lot of his pieces. And I think with Vosberg, this is not a typical Vosberg here, I guess, but in that but he can spend the time doing some of the details on there. And I always thought this was just one of the greatest covers of like the fake house, and it's just like, how fake is this entire town? You just sort of see it from the wood grain and that just the way that right hand side of it is just like, wow, this is really a fake town. It reminds me of like going to Paramount's backlot or something. You also notice the things that changed, right? There were words on this originally, which is interesting as well. And Scarlett's holding a gun and not necessarily her crossbow. So there, even there were some tweaks that I think either editorial made or Vosberg or other noticed when they were doing this. I'm sure taking the words out, but you get the feel of the fact that they feel safe when they're running there, but you don't need the words to say that anymore on the cover.
That crossbow, if I had to guess, it's Hasbro that said, give her the weapon that the toy comes with. There's another artist who was working at Marvel at this time, Ed Hannigan, who is well known for doing a lot of great cover layouts at Marvel in the late 70s, early 80s. And Ed Hannigan, in fact, penciled the cover to G.I. Joe 21. And lots of people get this fact wrong because a couple prominent websites got it wrong, because the signature, if the signature even appears on your bottom left corner of your copy of G.I. Joe 21, if it's not sort of hiding around the back, it's really hard to read. But there's an H, so people think it's Hama, right? But if that book was behind schedule, it wouldn't have made sense to have the guy rushing to draw the pages inside also draw the cover. But if you are, for our viewers, if you're interested in a little bit of this process of Marvel cover layouts, Gil Kane did a bunch in the 70s, right? Chuck, he was
primarily in the 70s. Yeah, I mean, I think he may have done some stuff. He was working more for DC in the 60s with Adam and other things. Yeah,
and then Ed Hannigan did a bunch of cover layouts for all different books at Marvel in the late 70s and early 80s. And Marvel and the Hero Initiative, which is that wonderful nonprofit, published a comic-sized benefit for Ed Hannigan back in 2009 called Ed Hannigan Uncovered, which talks a little bit about his process of doing these kinds of cover breakdowns, cover sketches, and reproduces some of them. And this is not a big, expensive book. This is a comic book sized comic. So in addition to this being related, because it's the same kind of image we see her on the left, Hannigan does have a small and key connection to G.I. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting, and Tim, maybe you have it already as part of your book, which is understanding issue by issue who did actually the cover layouts, because there are, for many Marvel books, whether it's Dave Cockrum or other folks that were doing these cover layouts, Maurice Severin was also known for doing a bunch of them in not G.I. Joe. But I'd be interested to see, I was always told that Hama did, the majority of them, and I know the ones that Zek had gotten, most of them were coming directly from Hama, but I'd be interested to understand which ones he didn't do. Just from a G.I. Joe historian perspective, maybe that's something that you can do some research and reveal one day. If you
I have not attempted that. I think some of those we may never know.
Yeah,
because the artists have died or some memories are a little fuzzy. I think the best we may do is that Hama did most of them for the first 100 issues and probably beyond.
Yeah.
But when I spoke to Mike Zeck when he appeared at a convention in London, I spoke to him briefly about this idea, and I think he said to me that not every single one of his G.I. Joe covers was based on a Hama layout. So some of them were, his pure originals without that underlying work from Larry. And you probably know better than
me.
I
don't know if I've talked to Mike about, and I guess I could ask him which ones he designed himself. Like I said, I talked to him, and it is funny to see like G.I. Joe 24 looks just like Zek's final thing. It's just Zek, finalized it and made it look really tight. But Hama's design is there.
Another factor in this formula or schedule is that 4 issues a year were advertised on television, and so those covers had to be completed earlier in the cycle.
Interesting. And you may know better again. I thought 10 was 11 was on. I remember 11 was a commercial, so I don't think 10 was on.
I mean, 24 was.
Yeah, 24 was.
And that's a Hama sketch, which becomes the Zek cover.
Maybe 10 was. I'm vaguely remember. I know 11 was because I remember that snow job,
if 11 was, 10 was. There is a list.
Yeah, it would have been.
But if 11 was, 10 certainly was not.
Yeah. Yeah,
'Cause
and
they
that
were-
was
they
done
were-
by 11 was done by Bob Camp, which was an odd choice because he had no connection to the series whatsoever, except he was in animation, I guess. So
I think the connection might have been sort of Marvel in general or Larry Hama.
that's correct.
So Larry in writing GI, Larry Hama writing GI Joe was his second job. His day job was being an editor at Marvel, where he was picking artists to work on Crazy magazine and a little bit later the Conan books. And so he was constantly, people were coming to his office and he's calling people and his assistant is calling people. And you'd ask someone because you know that they can deliver, or because they walk in the door, or because you're friends with them and you want to like toss them something.
Well, anyway, good example of a Larry Hama cover layout here.
Yes. Next,
Ooh.
what's our next slide?
What's next? Boom.
Ooh.
I wanted to make
Vosberg.
sure we got a Mike Vosberg in here. Although finding Mike Vosberg examples is a little tougher than, frankly, some. So I had explained this on the live stream that we had done with Mike. Mike was, G.I. Joe was probably, although we loved him working on that from his standpoint, he had worked a long time on She-Hulk, and then he gotten the assignment after Trimpe had left to work on G.I. Joe. But, frankly, didn't come from the same background as Trimpe, where Trimpe was in the war. Vosberg was not. He was. But for him, this was more of an assignment of drawing these characters, and also a little bit difficult because you had to stay on model. You had to, draw a whole host of it. It was a lot different than drawing, say, She-Hulk, which was more of a singular character. But I think he rose to the challenge on doing it. But one of the challenges too is Mike always liked to also ink his own work if he had time to do that. His favorite work is inking himself, and so I think here he was working with D'Agostino, who came. I think D'Agostino was known a lot for, I don't know, later in his years for working at Archie and other places, but had a very sort of different style than Mike did. And similarly, I think it was like Bob McLeod and Herb Trimpe. They had sort of two different very styles. So I think ultimately Mike didn't see all his work always reflected in the G.I. Joe artwork he did. And so as from the perspective of saving his favorite artwork, G.I. Joe was not necessarily his favorite artwork to save over the years. And so Mike was known. He taught classes in his spare time. Some people have reached out to me that said, "Hey, Mike was my teacher for a semester of for my art class." And at the end of the art class, he would just pull out a stack of pages and say, "Take whatever." Everybody gets one in the class, and so people would walk away with an original art page from Mike's collection. And I have a feeling that a lot of the G.I. Joe pages ended up in those giveaways. Sometimes he said he would give them away to kids at shows. He frankly wasn't there to sort of make a lot of money off of it. Because of that, it's very hard to find Mike Vosberg G.I. Joe pages. I have never, and you guys again may have seen more, I've never actually seen one of his original covers out there. He didn't, work on a lot of them. But have you guys seen a cover, original cover out there?
I can't remember to my knowledge.
I don't think I have. I've been looking for him for years. No. And the covers he started, he did 8, he did number 9, he did number 10, he did number 12, 13. And then after that, the one that we're showing here, that's actually a Herb Trimpe cover. I think he did 15, which is the other Quinn one in the airplane. But none of those have surfaced, and who knows exactly what happened to him. But Mike did keep a handful of pieces, and when I got to know him about 20 years ago, obviously G.I. Joe was top of mind, and I said, "Mike, I'd like to buy some of your artwork or whatever you've got." Mm-hmm. And I bought a lot of his other work for American Flag, She-Hulk, some other things, but he only had, I think at the time, maybe 2 or 3 pages remaining from G.I. Joe. And this is one that he took extra pride in. This was always his favorite image that he had drawn for G.I. Joe, and is the one when he gets recreation requests. This is the one that people also request. And, I love it just because this was a great storyline. I think at the end of issue 12, you sort of see the reveal that Snake Eyes has a face that's, that's all burned up and he's hiding it underneath the mask, and that's revealed. But the sort of the interplay between these 3 characters being stuck under the water here in a small enclosed space is just an amazing thing. And I think the the light and the dark on this. I just love the art composition of this particular piece here as well. Now, nice. It's also that it's the issue that had the first appearance of Destro, although obviously Destro is not on it whatsoever. And frankly, for those the bottom part, the indicia out, having that on the page as a splash page and the title, it next to a cover, this is really sort of as good as any sort of art collector would want. It's a nice big image, and it's sort of. I always thought these indicias and just sort of aligning it to when it was published and all that, even though that's all photocopied on, or it's photostated on there. It's just neat to have, and just sort of places it in a time and place. And you've got all the characters at the bottom and all the copyrights and all that stuff, which is kind of interesting to read.
And some tape. Do I see clear adhesive tape
on
the left and right?
Oh yeah.
What are the words that have been scratched out in the left and right margins?
That's interesting. Let me see if I have that page handy here and I can look at it live. I don't know if I do.
On the right, it's fixing. I think it's correcting the letterer and colorist's names.
I think so, and that would it's probably one of these things where they may not have known who the colorist was going to be. I think my gut is Bob Sharon was doing. I know he did the coloring on issue 13. So they probably had written in Bob Sharon and then decided to switch it over to Christine Scheel. And then same with the letterer.
And on the left it says move credits. And what I like about the credits down at the bottom is that, and I think a lot of fans kind of got wind to this, is that all of the kind of is it copywritten or trademarked characters that would eventually see release as toys would be named here. So you've got Hawk, Scarlet, etc. But if you've got a character introduced who maybe hasn't got a toy on the way, they're not going to be named down there. So we won't have Quinn, for example, because he doesn't have a toy to be trademarked.
At least at that point in time, he did not.
So. I think I'm seeing a cut just above that X on the left side next to the L of Larry, and then a cut just past Shooter's name. So I'm guessing what happened is they were accounting for a normal height for the indicia. They ended up getting this larger paragraph, and so they had to
with too many characters in it. Yeah.
So they had to redo the credits and move the credits up like a centimeter into the artwork.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing there's a little bit more inking underneath all these names. Can you scroll a little bit up, Mark?
Yep.
So we can focus on the. All right. So Diana Davis made a comment a minute ago that the lighting here is super dramatic, as if it is inked as if the flashlight is the only light source. And that would have to be a very powerful flashlight to cast such a glow. But that's the kind of drama that we expect from comics and TV and movies. Like I'm not so interested in sort of the realistic version where there's like 1/4 as much light and we can't see the characters. So you have these wonderful cast shadow behind Snake Eyes. And then D'Agostino is choosing to just in front of Dr. Venom's face to kind of stop drawing the shadow of Snake Eyes' arm and just sort of cross hatch it out like it's a gradient, because he doesn't want that solid black to slam into Dr. Venom's face. Same thing happens with the cast shadow of Venom's head behind his head where there's already a spotted black. Can you go up a little further, Mark? And then again, in terms of, I think Chuck is hinting at this with like, this is a memorable drawing of Vosberg's. So in terms of the story of a G.I. Joe splash page, right? Like we know that things are wrong because there's a crack in the ceiling and there's water trickling in and also like dropping and like streaming in. And then the water is now up to their, calves. Dr. Venom is holding a prop, which it's like you only hold a chair like that when you're about to swing it into a person or a window or a door to escape. And there's immediate conflict because of Snake Eyes' pose, right? So we have these two guys on the right in opposition to this guy on the left. And then Vosburgh makes this wonderful decision here to use a film term. This is at a Dutch angle. So if this was a camera on a tripod, the camera has been tilted to one side. And in film and television, a director does that to subtly or not subtly communicate to the audience that the character is off balance, often sort of mentally. And so we have this moment of worry and drama and conflict all in this one page. And one of the things that I love about comic art from the last century is that even though it's drawn for color, it's also drawn for black and white. And there are artists nowadays, and sort of the inking style of the last 20 years is you don't spot blacks this much because the colorist is going to create a gradient, right? Like, if we look at Quinn's arm just to the right of the flashlight, there are little cast shadows on those two muscles. And nowadays you wouldn't ink that. The color artist would do like skin tone and then darker skin tone and then darker skin tone. And that can be quite lovely. Vosburgh is in his pencils, presumably like picking out places for D'Agostino to ink, and then D'Agostino's inking. And so there's all this communication from shape, from line, from design, and from poses.
Tim, great analysis. I mean, I think you also pick up on the fact that, Mike went on in his career to become a storyboard artist for the movies. And so I think the idea that comic book artists, very easy translatable skill if you're very good at it as far as blocking. And I think cinema has an influence on just the way that comic book artists lay things out. And the very good ones know how to block and tackle that as if it was laying out a movie. And I think that's what we see in some of these G.I. Joe stories that's just so fantastic is this is laid out like a movie. Is like I'm joining it in the middle of a really tense scene, and I want to know what happens next. And I think this is where the combination of those two really work. But I do think Vosburgh was very good at sort of creating storytelling through his panels, and despite the fact that there's so many characters in G.I. Joe that you have to deal with. And I think some of my most memorable stories of the G.I. Joe storyline are from those issues in the teens, where you have the Dr. Venom storyline, and and then you have Baroness getting quote unquote killed and coming back to life, so to speak. But those were, to me, I thought those were the real sort of highlight of both story wise and just storytelling through the artwork, were those issues that Vosburgh was working on.
I have two other little comments on this. As a contrast, so I like Trimpe's cover, and I believe that's inked by Steve Mitchell. I do like that cover, but in terms of what we were talking about with the previous slide, that cover doesn't ask a question. Right. And my favorite covers ask questions or promise something, right? And I look at this splash page, and if it was actually the cover, I think you'd lower Quinn's arm with the flashlight so you could see more of Snake Eyes, and maybe it wouldn't be Dr. Venom, maybe it'd be like 3 Cobra soldiers. But the basics of it is there isn't really a story in the cover. It's a great shot, but there is a story here. And so in terms of like satisfaction, when I look at this page, I'm pulled in more quickly. And then Mark, can you zoom into the middle? Just to go back to sort of the difference between drawing then and drawing now. If you drew someone holding a flashlight now in comics, you would not ink that sort of inked halo around it, right? You might draw like an upper line and a lower line for a cone, but you'd probably let the colorist do a lot of the work, where the color would be a transparency, like a yellow transparency on top of Snake Eyes. Whereas here, there is no place for the colorist to color any of Snake Eyes within that halo. Like that's going to have to be white or light yellow or yellow.
Right. And Tim, I think the reason for the cover, again, you alluded to it, another commercial that was used. That I remember that one being used, and I think they were introducing Destro, and
yes,
that was why it was important.
Gotta sell the toy.
Gotta sell the toy. It was a commercial. It probably got made before the issue even got made, just so that they could have it out there. So
yes, the cover. So Hama has talked about how he would have to write a plot for an issue based on the cover that was going to be in the ad.
that's correct.
Speaking of issues that have an advert, our next page did indeed have its own advert and is somewhat of a classic. It ranks up there in the echelons of everyone's favorite issue. So here it is.
I'm even wondering. Oh, this one, yes. Man, I guess subliminally I was thinking of like which ones were on TV. I hadn't even thought about that when I selected the images that we were going to look at today. Yes, again, there's that great Mike Zeck cover. Didn't match to the artist inside. The artist inside was a guest artist, was Russ Heath. And, you know, folks may know Russ. He was really more known for his DC war artwork. He did a lot of stuff like All American Men of War, but Russ Heath known for, and also a lot of his, say fantasy, but some of like underwater stuff, but a lot of his very detailed work. So a different style. Russ did go on to work in animation for G.I. Joe, which, Tim, you may know if that was before or after this. I assume it was after, but
before.
It was before, and maybe that's how he got the job. But this was a fill-in. Russ was asked to do sort of a fill-in issue right after the sort of Vosberg's run was coming to an end. And I won't go into the detailed story on this one here, but focus in on just sort of the fact that Russ, I mean, when you look at this issue, I know we've talked about 21, we've talked about 26, which were both Hama drawn issues. For me, 24 is really the sort of the third sort of most classic issue, if you want to look at it that way, just because it's so well drawn and drawn from somebody that had really that experience of drawing in I'm gonna say a more classical style. And I think here you see even Destro looks a little bit more realistic than we've seen him in the past, where Vosberg's rendition of Destro is I would say a little bit more cartoony. Here you see almost a very realistic face on Destro, and the detail and especially the Baroness. I mean, Russ Heath, I got the pleasure of having him over to my house sort of towards the end of his life, and he loved to draw women. He was very much a ladies' man. Really enjoyed sort of drawing the female figure and that, and I think he really enjoyed, as did frankly many artists. I think Ron Rudat, Mike Vosberg, all loved to draw the Baroness, and I think the ones that were very good at drawing female figures really took to the Baroness very well. And in 24, you just have some great images of the Baroness throughout, including on this page. But what's at the end is obviously the big reveal of Zartan in the very last panel. And I think if you look at the artwork, and I don't know if you can see it, is that Wild Weasel that's next to him?
Yes.
I believe that the images of Wild Weasel, if you zoom in really, really close, were actually redrawn. So again, another thing where they may have either been working with the toy or they wanted to make sure that it was on model and change some things.
I'm seeing
a line around
him. Yeah,
exactly. I think he was cut out and pasted on to that particular drawing there. And I believe, do I have the page? Let me see if
Chuck, pull it off.
No, I can't do that.
I'll send you my asset. I'll send you my. I have an early Transformers cover, and there was something comped onto it, and I pulled it off.
If you see this is the back of the art, so you can see that they actually taped something on. It looks like they also taped something in the top panels there too. Yeah, it's the Wild Weasel panel at the very top.
Can you hold it up to the light and tell us if you see something through it?
Can you see something? You can sort of see some of the images there. But I think it's just that they cut out, if you look really closely, and you can actually see that they cut out Wild Weasel and put a new Wild Weasel image in there. So they actually literally cut the paper, cut out the Wild Weasel, and then put a new version in there.
Okay. It looks like it's at the cutout at the top and also at the bottom of the page too.
Yes, I think it's in both. And on the bottom, it looks like it's a paste over, as opposed to a complete cutout. It looks like they actually cut the paper right here.
Wow.
And they actually just put a new piece of paper in there, where on this one they pasted something new on top of it.
On the top, is it a cut under? Is that is the new art on the bottom of the page and taped into place? Is that what you're seeing?
On the bottom of the page, yeah, there's probably, again, if I shine a real light, there probably should be something underneath it. Although it looks like a stat.
Okay.
So it looks like they photostatted.
Yeah.
So
on
sorry
the
it doesn't play well on TV when I look at it that way, but
right.
this part does look like it is a photo stat that they had done. So they may have enlarged it from another drawing and then just pasted that on. I'd have to do some more analysis to see if there's actual art underneath there and just a different look and feel to Wild Weasel.
Yeah.
But again, I think you see that with toy art, whether it's G.I. Joe or Transformers. I think as it's getting towards deadline and they're trying to finalize the characters, when the artists are probably drawing the initial story, they don't necessarily have the reference that they need to draw the characters. So they typically, if you look at the pencils, they just sort of block in the character and say, when it's finalized, I'll go ahead and draw this in. And I think that's what happened.
Yeah, it was on the top of the page when you turned it around. There was a bit of paper underneath, which is, I guess, is the other side of where that Wild Weasel had been cut out.
So I want to point out. Mark, go for it.
I was going to ask as well if there's a story behind how you came by this very sought after art.
Sure. There's stories behind all these pieces.
It may not have been sought after when you got it, but
it probably wasn't. I remember being, I had a friend of mine that was up at a show in San Francisco, and I think I was still living on the East Coast at the time. And he was at the show, and I don't know if it was Big Wow or whatever the precursor to Big Wow show was, but Russ Heath was in attendance, and I think he had walked by Russ Heath's booth, or Steve Wyatt, who was working with Russ, and said, "Hey, they've got the complete G.I. Joe 24 on Russ's table. Do you want to go ahead and buy it?" And I think it was, I hate to quote numbers, maybe it was $5,500 or something like that at the time for buying everything. And I was just like, hey, how often do I get a chance to buy, a complete G.I. Joe story? And then also I just respected the fact that it was coming directly from Russ and that the money was going directly to Russ. And I think at the time, although that seems like probably a paltry sum today, that was probably a lot of money for G.I. Joe art back then. This was probably close to almost 15 to 20 years ago. So, at that time, G.I. Joe pages might have been going for $100 to $150 a piece, and that would have been over $200 a page. So it was paying a bit of a premium, but at the time, I was also like, Russ did such a great job on this particular issue, and you can't really say no to it. So I did pick it up. I had it in my collection for years. They actually did a Russ Heath exhibit where I lent some pages in Europe, where some of the pages were on exhibit over in Europe from this issue. But then another fellow collector, I do get occasional requests from folks to say, Chuck, I know you've got a big G.I. Joe collection. Will you let me have a piece or sell me a piece? And he was interested in buying this, and I'd known him for a while. And I said, all right, I guess I can let the complete book go, but don't break up the book. I don't want to, I was like, I'd like to keep it together if you do keep it. And then I guess good or bad, as soon as I did that, frankly, I regretted it. But again, it went to a good home. But 2 years later, he gave me a call and said, look, I'm thinking about letting it go. Do you want me to just sell it back to you? And I was like, absolutely. So that was a good occasion where I did let something go, but it did come back to me. And I'm very happy that it came back to me and that I can keep this together. So, yeah.
Can you go back to actually, okay, well, let's start with so one of the reasons why people love this issue, Diana Davis said so on a previous episode, is that it looks just like the show because Heath designed all the major characters for the show and a lot of the vehicles and props. At the same time, what this page doesn't have, and I know it's a quiet scene, it's just talking. What this page doesn't have is the same amount of like body twisting in space, physical energy and verve of, say, the previous slide with that Mike Vosberg splash page. And Heath's artwork has a lightness to it, right? His surface qualities, his accuracy, his textures are all extraordinary, but he's coming from a different place than the like Jack Kirby sort of like athletic action. I mean this in a nice way, like violence, like the violence of physicality, where someone isn't just like stepping, they're like lunging through space. And you can see it even to some extent if you compare this page to the cover and the sort of full slide. Something else that really, like, you know, we have this Zek drawing and the twisting of Storm Shadow's torso, the twisting forward of Roadblock, right? And this dynamic curl, the contrails from Cobra Commander's claw, right? This image is really sort of wound tightly, and there's a leisureliness to how people stand. Like look at Firefly's sort of surprise as he turns, right? There's a gentle quality to it. And so as much as I would have loved Heath to draw many, many more issues of G.I. Joe, his style is so different than a Zek that I think there actually would have been a little bit of a disconnect with compared to the covers, even though Heath is like, you know, one of the preeminent combat artists of comics. Something that I also love about this page is that on that top panel, Firefly and Wild Weasel are drawn in perspective, right? Like nowadays you would just draw that straight on, and then in Photoshop you would skew that image into perspective. And it's possible that Heath did that. He drew it flat and then he like turned it a little bit on the side and somehow traced that, or photographed that and traced that. But he probably just drew it freehand in perspective because he was that good.
Yeah, I mean, I think Heath was great. I do think this story, you know, there is some action that happens, but I remember at the beginning of the story, it's very much like, you know, Cobra Commander just standing there talking. It sort of lets it's a start and stop as far as the action on that. So there is a little bit more of standing around and letting the story be told by the words, rather than, you know, making the action do all the work in this case. So I guess even as a storytelling for this particular issue was a little bit different, which is maybe why they wanted to get Heath to do it. It's interesting. I don't think I've ever really gotten the full story as to why, you know, Vosberg left after 23, and then ultimately they did the transition in 24, and then had Springer take over in 25 as the regular artist. But I can speak to that very briefly.
Vosberg was ready to move on.
Yeah. No, I know mentally he was, but obviously, you know, for the book, he was a great artist for the book, frankly. So, but Springer, I know, had worked on, you know, with him, he was one of the regular inkers on She-Hulk and other things like that. So from a succession perspective, Springer made a lot of sense to bring on as the follow on.
That's a good point.
Worth pointing out as well that this, I think, is Zartan's first on-screen appearance, so on-panel appearance. So may as well just state that for the record. Wow, first Zartan.
That is, yes, before 25.
Okay, we have got a sort of incredible wealth of material here. So I'll push on to the next one, which is not to diminish how amazing that this page and issue is.
Warning team, as the sands of time descend, temporal disruption has set in, and it is here that we must leave our brave adventurers, Mark, Tim, and Charles. Remain patient, as we will pick up where we leave them in part 2 of this extended look at the original G.I. Joe art from the collection of Chuck Costas. Join us, if you dare.